This is the lower trim piece that goes under the lower housing here. And then here underneath that trim piece you have 3 of the bolts, and on the other side you have the other 3, and then there's also 2 bolts there. There's also these 2 bolts here, and Mike's heating the other 3 bolts that hold the power head on to the exhaust guide. And actually those bolts thread up through the midsection. And you know, here we're going to be trying to get those off. Of course, we're using PB Blaster and a torch and trying to get these bolts off. It's going to be a feat. We had to move some of these oil lines to get them out of the way of the heat. So we had to get them up out of the way so that we're not melting the oil lines, and we also had to take a water line out of the way. So we got the 6 main power head bolts out, broke off a couple of them. Now we're taking the carburetors off. These electrical connections will have to come undone. These are the oil lines we had to get out of the way. This long one goes to the top. The short one plugs in down here on this nipple, and this is on the right side of the engine. And also the pisser valve is disconnected. And then we'll have to disconnect the oil inlet here and the gas inlets on the carbs, and then the linkages. So here's how the linkages go. This is the throttle linkage right here. This is the shift shaft linkage here, and the shift shaft also has to be disconnected, and it's right there where my finger's on. You just pull that cotter pin, that shift shaft should be disconnected. Then we have to disconnect the positive and negative power lines from the starter motor, and that should be it. And then we should be ready to start lifting on the power head.
Figure about hour 3 so far.
Yep. We've been at this for about 3 hours.
No, this is the start of hour 3, I would say.
So I've disconnected the linkages. There's the shift shaft linkage right there. This is the throttle linkage, which was connected here. The shift shaft was connected down here. There was no need to remove that cotter pin. That can all stay on the power head. Shift shaft linkage, but the shift shaft itself is also, the linkage is kind of bolted onto the power head. You can see.
Pan towards you a little bit. Pan towards you. Bolted on the bottom of the head right there. If we pick it off, it's gonna come with it, so it's got to be undone because it'll snap inside the midsection of the unit.
What are there, 2 holding it on that you can see?
Yep.
What size are
12.
they? 12s. I'm getting ready to disconnect these wiring harnesses here because they're main feeds from the engine. I'm sure these are part of the computer information for the engine protection. So I'm getting ready to disconnect these 3 feeds, and also these cables here, which looks like I got pink to pink, orange to orange, gray with a black stripe. This wire on the stern side of the motor is gray with a black stripe. This wire is just gray, and then black to black down on the bottom. So I'll be disconnecting all of those and all of these wiring harnesses here, and then we should almost have everything disconnected off of the power head except for the oil supply line, which that's on the other side. We'll get that in a second. Alright, so this bundle here, this orange and pink and black bundle, it's in a flat casing, and it goes over here, like right here, and it's looks like the control wires for the trim and tilt. You can see it goes to the trim and tilt motor. Now this big bundle that's coming out of trim and tilt, it looks like the power supply. It connects in here. Full power supply bracket off there, because this will all stay with the lower half of the engine. It's not part of the, now this is. Now we're disconnecting this, looks like a
Computer box.
yeah, computer box, power interface, this box. We're gonna leave all this wiring with the bottom of the engine on the power head. Okay, we had to disconnect these wiring harnesses here, and also we disconnected the temperature sending unit, black to black and the grays to the red. As you can see, it's male to female, it doesn't even really matter. So now we got,
Okay, we got another sending unit on this side.
yep. We had to disconnect this other sending unit over here. Should be free and clear there. Once we disconnect this ground spike, should be good to go there. And we're trying to get it to break loose. I wouldn't pry against that. And hammering on the broken bolts. Just trying to get it to bust loose. So right now the big problem is, you know, it won't bust loose. We do have a couple of broken bolts, but it's just the studs that are down in there. We've got quite a bit of up pressure on it. In the one manual it says you can pry against the lower housing. That's an acceptable method, but we're not getting much luck there. I think we're going back to hammering, but this sucker's likely to break loose at any time. Not wanting to break free. We got quite a bit of pressure on it.
Couldn't get it up yesterday. Tried for about 3 hours. So I undid the bottom cowling, lifted it up a little bit, and I'm having to cut the bolts that were broke. There's one cut there. There's my other cut there. And it's going to be patched when I'm done. So that's what we're looking at. Hopefully I'll put the picker on it and that'll come up. And I left myself a little bolt to grab onto to get it out of the power head, and then I'll have to beat these out the bottom and should be good, hopefully. That's where we're at. Power head is up. Let me find the tools here. Aha. Alright, so I had to cut the bolts. There they are, what's left of them, and that one is right there. On the one side I only had the one bolt, which was this side. This is cat's paw, just any Lowe's, Home Depot. I stuck it in between those mating surfaces up underneath, right here, and just worked it in a little bit. As I got a little more room, I worked it back to the back here, and around to the right side. I worked it around front. I was out of the way, and it finally let go. So there it is. Of course, I was using heat, PB blaster on everything, but the head is up. I win, you lose.
So, of course, you can see there's the center section and the bracket, and the power head is off, which is the big feet. Mike got that off yesterday. This is the bracket that holds the steering arm down right here, and you can see the two prongs coming back from the steering arm here. It's right underneath the power head. And you know, there's a cut on a broken bolt, there's a cut on a broken bolt, and there's another cut on a broken bolt there. You had to make those cuts. That Powerhead wasn't coming off with them bolts like they were. So, you know, the piece we had to cut through here is called the exhaust guide, and you can see the water inlets and the exhaust outlets here. This is exhaust, water inlets, and we're thinking about replacing this exhaust guide, and you can see one of the dowels right there for the Powerhead alignment is right there. That's one of the dowels. I hope the other one's in the Powerhead, and I'm sure it is. But that's it. There's the two prongs coming back from the steering arm, and these are all the rubber bushings and everything on the steering arm. There's a lot of crap in there. We're gonna get there today. Of course, here it is with the lower cowl off. We've set the lower cowl over here. You can see how bad the steering arm was. I mean, ours completely broke. I mean, here's the other half of it down here in the power steering mess. It just, that was the slave arm for the power steering too, so we were out of commission there. Kind of got our hand forced on this deal. But you can see these three bolts hold this bracket down that holds that steering arm in. We think we're going to have to take this exhaust guide off, which I think we're going to replace anyway. Remember, because we cut it to cut through those bolts that had seized in there, it wouldn't let us get that Powerhead off. Alright, so on this exhaust guide, there's two bolts here below the steering arm, and since our steering arm was already fucked anyway, what we did was we just cut it out of the way. You know, here's the piece of the steering arm here that fits down in there. We cut it out of the way so we could get to these bolts on the exhaust guide. We're going to replace this exhaust guide in the steering arm anyway, so we didn't give a shit about any of this stuff. You see, now we can get on these two bolts to lift this exhaust guide up. We're replacing the exhaust guide too, because remember, we broke the three bolts. We broke a bolt here, here, and you can see again here and here where Mike cut through those bolts. And then on the other side where we cut through the bolt here. So now we got that midsection getting ready to go. Also, we had one that broke the head off there. We're going to deal with that later, but we're replacing this whole exhaust guide anyway, and all this is shit to us. It doesn't mean a thing. But now once we get these bolts out, now that Mike's cut this steering arm, we're going to get these bolts out, we're going to lift the exhaust guide off, and then we're going to go ahead and take the midsection back, because what's going to happen is we're going to have to reassemble all this with the new exhaust guide and the gasket
and the bolts sitting in here,
yep,
clamped down.
And the bolts are going to be sitting in here clamped down, and then the whole midsection then is going to go onto the steering arm.
The bolts will go through the new steering arm, and down bottom also. The bolts are going to have to slide through the bottom and the steering arm at the same time. The midsection has to come away from the boat,
yep, and
go back, slide back on.
Yep.
You can't drop this down with everything here. It's crazy. It's stupid. So the steering arm's going to go in the hole, then the whole midsection and this center plate is going to, with the bolts top and down near the lower unit, is going to slide on, and everything gets bolted from the front.
And this whole section here is getting replaced. I mean, we're replacing this at shit, so we're replacing this. We are also, of course, replacing the steering arm. That's why we're doing this whole job. But there you go.
Yep.
Cluster is all that's holding the steering arm on, and you're getting ready to see a little bit of brute force here. The splines down here are all that are holding this thing on, but it's been on there in salt water, so we're having to convince it off.
Persuade it. A little persuasion.
It's coming.
Watch this. Watch this.
Sayonara, bitch. We won. We won. Tillman Brothers won. Rusted steering arm, piece of crap, nothing.
Kaput.
The Statue of Liberty is kaput. All this for one freaking piece. The boat, minus all the parts we got to order, is fixed. We do have a bunch of parts to order, but steering arm finito.
Circle pin
Yeah.
that goes on the bottom of the steering arm is the only thing that holds this on.
Yep. This is just pushed.
It's
This is pushed on a spline.
And it holds it temporarily until you get your midsection bolted back.
Right.
Go ahead.
So now we're, you know, basically we took the front of the steering adapter off because this is an aftermarket power steering kit on this setup, but we have to get that adapter all taken apart and rigged so we can get it on the new steering arm. There's the old, you can see the old steering arm in there, but this is threaded, and this nut, this hex nut, is going to be a bitch, and we don't feel like screwing with it today. We're done for today, so we'll deal with all this crap, you know, while it's here. We don't have to have the boat here for that, but the steering arm is on. What a pain in the ass. As you can see, the whole freaking outboard basically has to be disassembled piece by piece, and there wasn't one really forgiving bolt in the whole mess because this boat's been in salt water its whole life. But
Well, the steering arm was 26 years old.
yeah,
26 years.
yeah, but it's, you know, it's done.
91.
New steering
And
arm.
it's 2016. So what? 25 years, whatever.
Yeah. So here's a part that we didn't get to show you. So here's the midsection that's off, and you know, we kind of didn't show this part, but it's kind of important because since we had to cut this, remember, we had to cut the exhaust guide. When you lift the exhaust guide off, basically you got the water tube going down in there and then the muffler assembly. So what I wanted to show you is this is the assembly. This is what the assembly looks like when you pull it all out of there. And there's a lot of components to it. You have the exhaust guide, which that's the piece we're replacing, which I'll show you the new one in a second. And below the exhaust guide, you have the exhaust manifold. And then below the exhaust manifold, and in here you actually have the exhaust pipe, which is the exhaust pipe. So, you know, the exhaust pipe attaches to the exhaust manifold and is down in here. Well, here's the bad news. In order to replace the exhaust guide, which goes on top of the exhaust manifold, which goes on top of the muffler, all this all this is together as one piece. This is the bottom of the exhaust guide. Then of course there's going to be a gasket underneath here, and then the first piece that goes on is the exhaust manifold. Once the exhaust manifold goes on, this is the exhaust pipe. There's another gasket that goes under here. And then the last piece that goes on is the muffler. And the muffler goes on over the exhaust pipe. So this whole assembly, once you get this all back together, I think it's 12 bolts or something. But once you get all this back together, then that goes back into the midsection. And it bolts onto the midsection with just 4 bolts. The new midsection, kind of partially assembled for demonstration purposes. So this is the new midsection piece, and you can see the flange that holds the bolts down that go through to the steering arm that we put on. And you know, the bottom line is on this job, basically what holds this midsection on are these 4 bolts. You have the 2 bolts down at the bottom that go to the lower case, which is down at the bottom of the steering arm, and then you have these 2 bolts here coming out of this the exhaust guide, and those two pieces go into the upper piece of the steering arm. So those 4 bolts are all that hold the main motor onto the assembly. So I mean, technically, if everything was okay with these bolts, and you could have got those nuts off the steering arm, and you get these nuts off at the bottom, these 2 nuts, and you had some kind of a forklift that could, you know, squeeze in its arms and just lift the motor, you could pull the motor straight back and then get at that steering arm without having to do all this. But our problem was, you know, everything was corroded so bad on these 2 bolts that went into the steering arm, you couldn't even get the nuts off. So, you know, it was just better to approach this which is the way we did, which, you know, is outboard motor and a gazillion pieces in the garage. But it's all ready to be reassembled. Now I'm working on a whole nother fiasco. But I wanted everybody to see the exhaust guide.